commemoration of, as poll after poll shows, continued commemoration of these horrors remain an important part, remain important, as historical knowledge of these events is fading away as fast as our last survivors. Today, a full third of American millennials do not know what Auschwitz was. Recent comparisons between the Holocaust and the COVID-19 pandemic has also clearly demonstrated breathtaking ignorance by many who ought to know better. Especially disconcerting are continued attempts by elected officials, both here and abroad, to see lines of continuity between the tyrannical and murderous Nazi regime and their own governments. Let me state this clearly and in the strongest possible terms. There is nothing comparable between the two. Curfews and stay-at-home orders are not a so-called slippery slope to cattle cars and death camps, as has been recently suggested in Idaho, Pennsylvania, and Kansas. Vaccination registration records are in no way similar, as elected officials in Kentucky and indeed even in Ohio have suggested, to the yellow stars Jews were forced to wear in Nazi Germany. State governors and healthcare officials are not part of a, quote, globalist cabal to undermine liberty, an old, tired, but effective mythical anti-Semitic trope historically used to incite violence. And perhaps most repugnant of all, voicing displeasure over pandemic mitigation efforts does not make one a modern day Anne Frank, Sophie Scholl, Raoul Wallenberg, or Jan Karski. That is, people who actually risked or lost their lives in fighting Nazi tyranny. Such specious comparisons, simply used as a rhetorical bludgeon against political opponents, does not make one clever. Rather, it trivializes the monumental pain and suffering we are here to commemorate today and displays a spectacular lack of critical and historical awareness. Having said that, we are lucky today to be joined by one of the leading scholars of the Holocaust, Professor Guy Miron, who is currently the Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Open University of Israel and has been director of the Center for International Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem, Israel's National Holocaust Museum. He is the author of 5 books and at least as many edited collections, most notably Yad Vashem's Encyclopedia of the Ghettos During the Holocaust. And today we're lucky because he will give us real factual insights into what it was like for Jews to be targeted for exclusion based on largely racial hatred. His talk today is entitled People of the Air, the Spatial Experience of German Jews in the Third Reich. Professor Miron will speak for 40 or 45 minutes, we've agreed to, and after which there will be a question and answer session. I am suggesting that as things come up, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. My colleague at the OCHGE, Tim Mernon, is going to be manning the chat room and leading our discussion side of things. So please do put in your questions, and I turn it over to Professor Miron.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon to all of you. And I'm happy for this opportunity to share some of my new project. Which is a project about the way German Jews during the Nazi regime experienced space and time. I will speak about the spatial part of my project, but I also write about time. If any of you is interested, I can later send to Mark some of the articles in English based on this research. Before I start, I will mostly read my lecture and share with you some of the sources, because part of what I want to do is to share with you the voices of the people, the individuals, and the public speakers during this period. Maybe one word to continue, and maybe to take another perspective of what Mark said about the comparison between the Holocaust and the Corona, which we don't have in Israel in the context you raised, but I actually made most of my research before the corona started. When the corona started, I found out that I can see certain interesting parallels, but in a totally different perspective from what you mentioned, Mark. I mean, I don't speak about the policy of the Nazi government, which cannot be compared to anything today, but the dilemmas of individuals being excluded from public spaces and the way they experience time when they feel isolated sometimes make me think in a way about what we feel today. And I don't mean to compare one-to-one, but rather to say that maybe what we experienced in the last year during the United States, in Israel, can help us a little become a little more sensitive to what these people that we speak about now experience during this time under a totally different political circumstances, which should not be compared in any case. So I will start the talk. I will mention a few case studies and then we'll share the sources. In April 1933, the Berlin lawyer Siegfried Neumann experienced the expulsion of Jewish jurists from German courts. At the same time, Victor Klemperer, a professor of Romance languages at the Technical University of Dresden, was born Jewish and converted to Protestantism before World War I, referred in his diary to Jewish students and professors being blocked from universities and students' homes. In early April 1933, the Breslau diarist Walter Tausk described how SS and SA patrols enters coffee houses, ask for clients to identify themselves, forcing out anyone who looked Jewish. Going to German theater, reported the Berlin Jewish schoolteacher Heinemann Stern in his memoirs, became already in the first months after the Nazis conquered the regime, something that German Jews gave up almost self-evidently. During the first months after the rise of the Nazi regime to power in Germany, Jews were excluded from a variety of public spaces. This process was not only an outcome of the Nazi top-down policy. In many cases, exclusionary practices were conducted by the initiative of local groups of individuals, escalating the spatial exclusion of the Jews from bottom up. Okay, I will mention here that in generally, in talking today about the history of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust and the way Germans related to the Jews, there's always a tension between the top-down descriptions, between the Nazi regime planned in a systematic way how to persecute the Jews, which in a way might help some of the German discourse saying we didn't know, we were not involved, etc., etc. And the bottom-up perspective saying that because of Nazi propaganda, because of local hatred to the Jews, some of the developments developed from the German society. And this is part of what we have to consider. Hearing a remark like, what Jewish women are doing here was enough to drive away a Jewish mother and her children from a traditional children's festival in the small city of Eichenwald. A Heil Hitler greeting by a Leipzig parfumist made it clear to the Jewish local child he should not enter the pharmacy again. Excluding Jews from public spaces, which can be interpreted as part of a larger process of the Nazi production of space, occurred in a variety of various stages and a different phase, depending on the location. German historian Michael Wild has shown how during the first years of the Nazi regime, isolation of the Jews in rural areas and small towns was much more swift and harsh than in the cities. Recreating a free of Jews, Judenfrei, German public space, he asserted, was a fundamental principle of the Nazi effort to create a racial national community, Volksgemeinschaft, upon the ruins of German bourgeois society. In my talk, I will examine the special aspect of German Jewish experience under the Nazi regime. I will try to show how Jews came to terms with the Nazi policy of exclusion and adapted to the escalating spatial situation by employing what Michel de Certeau used to call tactic in their daily life practice against the strategies of the Nazi hegemonic power. And again, trying to zoom out from what specifically I'm saying here, that the Holocaust scholarship, Holocaust historiography is dealing with this tension between describing the Nazi persecution of the Jews, where the Nazis are conducting the policy and the Jews are the objects, and also talking about Jews as agents coming to terms with the Nazi persecution. And basically, my perspective is trying to show not only the way the Jewish spatial experience was persecuted by the Nazis and they were excluded from spaces, but actually mostly to see how Jews try to cope with this harsh situation in a variety of ways as agents. And this is a very center in my talk. Based on real-time accounts, private diaries, and Jewish press, I will try to present the transformation of the role of the viral spaces, the public space, Jewish spaces like synagogues and cemeteries, and also the private home under the new circumstances. This transformation, which were part of the recreation of Jewish space under exclusion, had an impact on the self and the identity of the German Jews. In an overview, one can say that there were two major forms of Jewish reactions to the growing exclusion of Jews from the public space. Both were expressed both in the private individual diary writing and in the public discourse. Sometimes you could find the same diarist or the same writer relating to these both reactions. And again, thinking about each of us in not similar situations, but situation of problems with public space, we can think about a variety of reactions. So the first one, and I will now share the screen and give a few examples, can be described as growing alienation from the German public space, which became the Nazi public space, and also dissociation from it. The motives for this reaction are not always described. Sometimes it's kind of an inevitable consequences of the situation. You are excluded, so you feel alienated, and you try to dissociate. Sometimes it's a clear choice how to conduct your life and your consciousness in this situation. Sometimes it's a way to express your dignity, and sometimes it's a matter of it's a reaction of fear or an unbearable situation. So let us see some of the sources. Can you see now?
Looks good.
Okay. Martha Appel was a Jewish woman, lived in the city of Dortmund. In this case, it's not a diary, it's a memoir. And you see how she experienced this dissociation. From then on, after a specific event she experienced, I hated to go out, since on every corner I saw new signs that the Jews were a misfortune of all people. Never did anything unpleasant happen to me on the street, but I was expecting it on every moment, and it was always bothering me. So the very expectation for that something would happen to her made her actually dissociate from the German public space. Willy Kohn, the diarist I already mentioned, and he is one of the central individuals will be discussed here. He is describing the dissociation in a more specific way. All over the city, he was living in Breslau in East Germany, today it's Poland. All over the city, there are now boards of the Nazi party with the Der Stürmer, the Nazi radical anti-Semitic propaganda journal. I figuratively don't see them anymore. I mean, he developed a way just not seeing these signs anymore. This is actually a way for him to cope with the situation and to survive. Now, the third quote, from which I took the quote of my talk, is from Hans Reichmann, one of the central activists in the Jewish liberal organization of German Jews, who wrote a memoir in London in 1939 after leaving Nazi Germany, after a few weeks in the concentration camps. He's writing, "We have become Luftmenschen." Luftmenschen is people of the air. I don't have time to get deeper into the history of this concept, but in this context, it means we are actually dissociated from our Heimat, from the place we grew in, from what was until recently our intimate place of belonging. We lost touch with the soil. We were cut from the security of the bourgeois life, with no work, no home, and no homeland. And you see how he's actually coming to terms with this situation. The second pattern, which could be described as defiance, and I use here the concept of my colleague Wolf Gruner from University of Southern California, it's a kind of a struggle on the public space, which means those people who are using or turning to this defiance are trying to use different ways, different tactics to come to terms with the growing isolation and to continue clinging to the public space in their daily life. And these are in here are a few examples. So the first one, and it refers to Victor Klemperer, and this refers to his car. I mean, 1930s, 1920s, 1930s is the time in which the private car is becoming more and more popular in Germany. And Victor Klemperer, who is a lecturer in Dresden University, fired from his job in 1933-34. His economic situation is not so well. Still, he decides to buy a car. And there is no, I mean, we usually buy a car in order to, especially if we are grown-ups people, responsible people. He was around 50 years old at the time, because we need it. We have to drive to work. We need it for our economic well-being. We don't just buy a car to, if you are responsible to show off. But Victor Klemperer actually bought this car actually to survive mentally. And you see how, along with his academic career, which is very central in his diary, and we'll get back to it soon. I mean, writing for him is a way to express his own self. Driving is becoming, for the years 1935 to 1938, a major experience for Klemperer. When he buys the car, he's writing, the car will give us a little bit of life and the world again. I mean, it's clearly a way to come to terms with the situation. Another diary entry, victory over my own nature and a matter of utmost importance. This is what he writes when he passed the test of driving, which was very difficult for him. It was not clear and easy, but he struggled for it because for him it was a way to express his life and his way to which he belongs, sorry, to the German space. And while writing about it, sometimes he's got his doubts. I mean, he's writing about driving to different places. You might see in his diary, the way to sum up what he did in a certain week or a certain month is how many pages did I write in my new research and how many kilometers did I drive. It becomes a way to express his life. But still he's asking in March 1936, is a Jewish professor allowed to have a car to be noticeable in any way? Which means already in March 1936, he foreshadows what is going to happen almost 3 years later on, when it will be forbidden for Jews to drive cars. I mean, he feels it in the air. And then 2 months afterwards, in a cynical way, he writes, Auto über alles, which is a kind of a parody to the German, to the Nazi hymn, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Car overall, it has taken a terrible hold of us. Now, in the New Year Eve of 1938, is writing about. Actually, this is the late 1938, which means after the pogrom of November, when Jews cannot use cars anymore. Until December, more or less, I still had the use of my car, and we were mobile. it was a little bit of freedom and life after all. He repeats the word life, which means this is a way for him to attach and to hold of life in this situation, no matter how piable it may have been. By the way, if you follow, I mean, I didn't plan to write about Klemper's driving experience. You know, I just read the library, and it just came out that driving was a way to express his own life. In the years to come, until he survives the Holocaust because he's being converted and married to a non-Jewish woman, he even dreams about the car. I mean, he misses it and needs it so much, not to drive to a specific place, just to express his belonging to the space, that it still becomes a very central for him. And one short example of another way to cope the situation, after the car is being taken from him, after he and his wife are being excluded from their homes, from their private home to Judenhaus, a house in which a variety of Jewish families are being concentrated. They are starting every evening long evening walks. And again, it's not a habit that they took from life before. This is a new way to come to terms with the situation and to express life in the way in which they still can do it. A series of extended walks have been added to our usual activities, and this is only one example. He repeats about it every time. You have to remember that Jews in Germany from 1939 were exposed to there were evening curfew, every night curfew. They had to get back home until 9 or even 8 p.m. every evening. And Klemperer and other diarists were using every second they could to get hold of the public space. So this is the first part of my talk about the public space. Maybe just a short word about the libraries. For Klemperer and also for Willy Cohn, which I mentioned before, both were historians, their academic work was a major part of their identity and daily life and routine. In 1938, not only cars were forbidden, but also Jews could not enter the public libraries anymore. And of course, they did not have Zoom, internet, PDF, nothing. They were cut off from the way to work and actually to express their selfhood. And Klemper writes in December 1938, and this is exactly the time when the car is taken from him, the library is taken from him also. And he's writing, I'm literally now without work, which means life lost their meaning, but he doesn't give up. A few days after it, and I don't have the citation here, he's finding a new way to express his life and to express his identity and to write, and he's deciding that his new project will be his curriculum vitae. He's going to write a scholarship about his own private life and its context, and for this he will not need any library at all, and this is again a way to create a personal space, even in a figurative way. For Willy Cohn, the way to come to terms with the problem of the library was to find a small library, which was not a public one, and to find a way there to express to continue his activities. I will go now to speak about the Jewish spaces, and for this I need a little context. In the early modern period, before the emancipation of the Jews, before the integration of the Jews in Germany, synagogues were used by Jews in Europe not only as places of prayer, but also as places of gathering, and actually for social activities. They were very comfortable, also a place for secular activity between members of the community. During the emancipation period from the late 18th century, mostly in the 19th century, German Jews were, like actually Protestants and Catholics, having a more separation between the public religious sphere and secular sphere. So synagogues became, from house of gathering, they became now houses of God. And this was only a place where you came to pray, to pay your due to God. It actually became a sacred place, a temple. And this is why not so many Jews came to the synagogue so often, because they found alternative places to have their social daily life. Now, what happened after 1933. What happened after 1933? And actually, even before 1933, even when anti-Semitism was becoming more and more strong in the environment, in German environment in late Weimar period, historian Yaakov Borot has shown that the growing anti-Semitic pressure against Jews in the late Weimar Republic, and even more, of course, during the first years of the Nazi regime, pressed the Jews now to concentrate more and more activities within Jewish spaces, which means the special distinction between secular and sacred spheres in Jewish life was now diminishing because of the exclusion of Jews from German public spaces. In many small communities, synagogues became the only spaces in which Jews could gather during the Nazi era, and therefore became the center of various activities. The synagogue asserted the Jewish communal leader during an opening of a concert in a rural community in September 1933, has now returned to fulfill its original function, house of gathering. And if some of you know Hebrew, Beit Knesset means actually not house of prayer, not house of God, it means house of gathering. And it became, again, house of gathering because of the situation. And again, we see the Jews as active agents rearranging their life under these circumstances in order to make them meaningful. Now, sometimes there is a strong need to go there than in the past. Willy Cohen writes about going to synagogues in Breslau in June 1933. And Martha Appel for Dortmund writes in a memoir, never in my memory had been so much activity in our community house. From the basement to the attic, there was no single space where a group of people was not taking a course of any sort. In certain communities, synagogues now were open all over the day, offering gathering of places for those interested in internal concentration, to think about the meaning of life. A particularly compelling discussion concerning the overlapping of religious and secular activities was read in September 1933, when a Berlin community official refused to cover his head while making a speech during a secular event. Following this event, a reporter of one of the Jewish journals raised the various of ideas to create a differentiation between religious services and secular events conducted in the same space, in the synagogue. For example, to close the Torah ark during secular events, and this will be a way to define the same place as a secular one. To take it even more radically, in the first years of the Nazi regime, sport activities became more and more popular for the Jewish communities, and one of the ways to cope with the social exclusion, which is Jewish sport activities became specifically popular during the Olympic Games in 1936, where Jews were excluded, but they could have their own sport activities. Jews could have their sport activities mostly in closed spaces. They have to create substitutes. And then in 1936, 1937, we see very interesting reports that synagogues are used also for sport events, which is really weird if you think about Jewish tradition. The original aim of synagogue, this is against the Jewish tradition, but what is important here is life. And because of the needs of the living, this is a more important value than the traditional separation between holy and secular. Now, maybe let's turn, because of our time, to speak a little about cemeteries, which is another Jewish space that was highly transformed during the Nazi regime and gained new functions. It is probable that the regularity of visits of Jews in cemeteries has diminished during the emancipation era, which means cemeteries were more popular in traditional Jewish life, and when Jews became modern and bourgeois, cemeteries were marginalized in their daily life. The bourgeois ethos also deepened the gap between the living and the dead. And as one of the historians dealing with it is saying that in the modern era, death disappears from daily life, and attention paid to the Jews in past centuries is now concentrated on the here and now. Those of you who are more dealing with sociology, this comes to terms with the assertion of sociologist Norbert Elias, by the way, a German Jew born in Breslau, actually approximately the generations of Willy Kohn that we mentioned now. He has a very interesting book called The Loneliness of Death, where he's describing the modern cemetery as a very sterile space, which is totally separating between the living and the dead. Now, what is happening to German Jews after the Nazis come to power? Again, because they really need spaces, because of their exclusion from the German public spaces, they turn to the cemeteries in a different way. Let's begin from the first source of Edwin Landau. And you see how the Nazi rise to power is pushing him to the cemetery to talk with his ancestors. I went to the graves of my parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. Actually, these are the generations of German Jewish emancipation, and spoke with them. I returned to them everything German that I've received from 3 generations, actually taking out all the legacy of emancipation, and that I have absorbed and cultivated. I cried into their graves. You are mistaken. I too have been misled. I now know that I am no longer a German, and what will be my children? The question remained open. The graveness became silent. In the new political circumstances, cemeteries could now become sometimes a place of political protest, and this is also interesting. Willy Kohn, that we mentioned before, he reported in his diary in September 1934, at the eve of the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, that a mass of Jews approached the Breslau cemetery. Now it became popular. Many of them visited the grave of a Jew murdered in a concentration camp to express their loyalty to their co-religious victim. The traditional Jewish practice of visiting cemeteries on this date became now popular under the circumstances and was loaded with a new meaning, a Jewish response of dignity to the Nazi terror. As the special exclusion of the Jews in Germany escalated, especially following the November 1938 pogrom, Jewish cemeteries were the last spaces in which German Jews could conduct in open-air activities. During the early 1940s, Jewish communities created children playgrounds within cemeteries. Initially annoyed by this fact that his daughter Susanna played in the cemeteries, Kohn learned to accept it, and you see here in the second citation. Nowadays, children have so little joy. This is the only thing left for us. I mean, the playing and the children playing within the cemeteries is the last a place of relative security. Kohn and his 2 younger daughters and his wife were deported in late 1941 to Kovna in Lithuania and murdered there. We found his diary after the Holocaust, and his family published it later on and also translated it to Hebrew. But we can continue to follow how Jews were using cemeteries in Germany, the core years of the Holocaust, by the diary of Victor Klemperer, who, as I said before, survived in Dresden until 1945. Now, for him and from his diary, we see how cemeteries became places of refuge and even of recreation. Also for adults, from late 1942, after most Dresden Jews were already deported and the condition of life grew increasingly harsh, Victor Klemperer started to visit the Dresden Jewish cemetery. Disinterested in the cemetery as a space of Jewish memory, as I said before, it was converted. Klemperer motives was purely social. Yes, and you see how he relates to it. He meets two of his friends. For Magnus and Steinitz, the cemetery was a refuge. They are always inviting me to come with a book. the cemetery administrator has in his house out there. He says he does not need to fear of a house search. I mean, this time the Jews already still in Germany were exposed to violent house searches of the SS. They could come every minute in the morning, in the night, to a violent house searcher. This is why Klepper, for example, stopped writing his curriculum vitae, because he was afraid, and he continued with his diary, really risking his life. But the cemetery was safe. The Gestapo is afraid of the dead. This is what the Jews in the cemetery were saying, probably laughing during this time. And in another entry in October, he writes, they smoke, they fritter their time away, they play cards, they are happy to see visitors. And I myself am no longer in awe of the graves. One should become hardened. Now, again, I see this as a very interesting example of defiance, or the way in which Jews are resisting the Nazi terror by way of conducting life in this very radical circumstances. In the first generation of Holocaust scholarship, I think not only in Israel, but also around the world, resistance was associated only with the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and with the underground activities, which are, of course, very important. But now I think today, maybe because of cultural history, because of the perspective we have today, we can see also this kind of experiences. And by the way, the very conducting of a diary is the way of coming to terms and defying the Nazi persecution. Now we'll pass to the last part of my talk, which will be about Jewish home. The ratification of the German public space led many Jews to avoid public spaces and push them to turn inward. Home, therefore, became, at least for a certain period, a positive and safe pole in contrast to the city, to the public space. And these circumstances led to a major change in the daily routine of many Jews, predominantly men. Heinrich Marx, and I said predominantly men because in this bourgeois society, women were associated to be at home because of the division of labor between men and women also before 1933. Now you can see in the diary of men how they became much more domesticated, you might say. Heinrich Marx, a young Jobelin Jewish journalist, reported in his diary in May 1933. And you can see here, my life has been fully reshaped. Whereas earlier I have sat all day long in the library and always felt there very well there. Now I'm always dependent on my room, and it makes me happy to feel there so cheerful. And the word originally is gemütlich, which might have to be translated differently. It's a very German bourgeois word, speaking about feeling comfortable, feeling at home, feeling good. But staying close at home for weeks and weeks, and again, this is a way when I think that our experience in the last year is making us a little capable of understanding their experience is not an easy experience. Spending more time in private sphere made German Jews feel safer, but it could, however, also become depressing. Diaries sometimes describe their seclusion by employing metaphors of burial and imprisonment. And you see Klemper in 1935, how old have I become? Apart from going shopping into the library, until he was also banned from the library, I sit and work all day. Then, apart from large amount of time spent on cat boxes and making tea and coffee. Altogether secluded life, quieter and more enclosed than before. And later on, he relates to a metaphor of burial. For weeks, I've been unable to settle down and make my diary entries. Always buried in my third chapter, and actually meaning buried also at home. The Nazi exclusion policy, as well as the economic problems of German Jews because of this policy, forced many of them to leave their original homes and move to cheaper houses, mostly smaller houses in less developed areas of the city. And you can see here how Willy Kohn already in May 1933 is understanding that he will have to live in his apartment and actually preparing for this, and leaving your apartment is kind of feeling of unrooting. Again, you can not compare it to the deportation of Jews like Vili called himself later on, but it's a kind of an experience that we can understand at the beginning of the exclusion and the persecution is here. Leaving a place that you belong to after so many years is really a threat. And by the way, I was really looking for the diary entries which will describe how he actually came to terms with his moving when it actually happened. But this diary, this notebook from the diary was lost, and so we'll never know about it. And this is just an experience of how scholarship is trying to cope with the problem of sources. And now I have to finish in a few minutes, and I want to give you only one last example on how German Jews are trying to become agents, actually to create meaning to this situation of having to move to smaller places, not only to become victims of the Nazi exclusion policy, but also to recreate the meaning of their life in these harsh circumstances. And interestingly, if you follow the German journals, German Jewish journals of this time, and small and important remarks, the Nazis enabled the Jews in the first years of the Nazi regime until the pogrom of 1938 to have their journals, of course, not to become political, not to speak against the Nazi regime, but the Jewish internal life are being very interestingly expressed in the Jewish journals, and this is a fantastic source for historians. Now, specifically, the domestic issues were dealt with mostly in women supplements of the Jewish journals, and this is one example of it, where a Jewish writer and public activist Meta Zamson is writing about this process of moving from a house to a small room and how Jewish families cope with it. Nowadays, many Jewish families give up their apartment in order to rent a furnished room for a shorter period of time until a new field of work is found, or even unlimited time. And this is, of course, because of the economic situation and because of the persecution. She can't write about it because of the Nazi censorship, but it's very clear. This means much more than an external change. I mean, moving from a five room apartment or private house to a small room for a whole family is not only an external change, and we can all understand this, of course. Giving up possession, which comes with this decision, breaks the mindset and way of feeling, and together with it, the actual core around which the shell of our outer life is wrapped. The Jewish wife and mother, who is occupied and busy with daily duties connected to the household, suddenly faces an outer void. This is a departure point for her to discuss what should be done, how the meaning of home should be recreated. And again, it goes with agency and with defiance. The Jewish housewife who loses with her house also her rank and position of life, which she held beyond the small circle of the family, has now to find again her personality. Most shy away, retreat from this task. The path which has to be walked to reach it is blocked and dislocated. They, the Jewish women, try to save. They can still be saved by stuffing the furnished room with anything that reminds them the old standard of living. But what's she says later on, sorry. This is important. Furnished room filled with foreign life and fate, disconnected threads can never replace home, Zuhause. This faithful dissolution of the family is expulsion from home, and the loss of familiar feeling of belonging together will surely have a great and unforeseeable impact. And I think I didn't put here the last remarks, which are very important, and this will help me maybe to to sum up my talk. Then she talks about the challenge of the Jewish women to create home, not as a physical space, but as an emotional space of the family. And this is the challenge of the Jewish woman. And this is how she has to rebuild her home in these two circumstances, which means home is not only a physical space, but it's most condition or an emotional space. So I have to sum up. I didn't get into the last period, the time of the expulsions and the deportations, but I think when we speak about the history of the Jews during the Holocaust, even talking about the first years of persecution under the Nazi regime, and trying to understand how people came to terms with the situation of growing persecution and trying to redefine their life, and most important, recreate their agency and the dignity as individuals, is very important today in the historiography of the Holocaust, and also in Holocaust education, because it has to do with the way people are coming to terms with challenges and trying to define and protect their dignity against persecution of all kinds. I think I will finish here and open for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Tim, do you see any interesting questions in the chat so far?
Yes, they're starting to pop up. So let me, give me a second to just clear a couple things out. So Allison, I'll do the best here. And if I mess it up, you can chime in. Dr. Marone, have you seen accounts that speak directly about what it's like to be forced to give up spaces and or into seclusion as a result of such extreme hatred?
I didn't really understand. I didn't clearly understand the question.
So it's in the chat. If you open the chat, maybe you read along with me. Have you seen accounts that speak directly about what it's like to be forced to give up spaces and or into seclusion as the result of such extreme hatred? Yeah,
I mean, I see a lot of accounts of Jews having to give up the spaces. Let me give you one example. Victor Willicom, that I described a little in different contexts, writes a lot about his city, Breslau. He's a patriot of his city, and if you follow his diary, and I assume that some of you, I mean, most of you probably from Cleveland, if I understand, or from another city, or we were born in a city, and many of us are very attached to the place we grew in. I mean, really a patriot of Jerusalem. And imagine how more and more parts of his beloved city, where he spent most of his life and is very emotionally attached, are being recreated and actually confiscated from him. He's not only because of it is forbidden for him to be there, but because they are becoming Nazified. And he's writing a lot about it. I think now, for example, about an entry of his diary in one of the Christmas Eves. Being a traditional Jew did not prevent him from feeling a kind of a holiday during Christmas for most of his life. But now, under the Nazi regime, Christmas is becoming a Nazi experience, and the city is becoming even more Nazi during Christmas, and he's writing a lot about it. So this is only one example. You can see how he's writing, and other diarists are writing about visits of Hitler or Goebbels in their cities where they are becoming more and more isolated. So there's a lot of examples for it. And this, of course, speaks when the Jews are being isolated in Jewish houses and they cannot go out anymore. And one maybe even more radical experience, if we come to September 1941, where the Jews in Germany are now forced to have their yellow badge, and you read the diary of Victor Klemperer, this is again a special experience for him because of the yellow badge. He said, I cannot go out anymore. I mean, I'm feeling totally alienated from my environment.
So Michael asks a really interesting sequence of questions here. Did the gatherings lead to covert or overt organized resistance, or only accidentally as a result of the need for normal human rhythms like walking or recreating? In other words, did the experiences lead to more clearly oppositional political program on the part of German Jews?
I think the best way, basically the answer is no, because you could not really expect German Jews. Less than 1% of the population in Germany to organize active political resistance against the Nazi regime. Think about the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, such powerful agencies. After a few months of the Nazi regime, they could not arrange any kind of effective resistance at all. But, and this gets back to one of my first remarks, this has to do with the question how you define resistance. I mean, actually, from my perspective, from my interpretation, has to do with a wider historiography turn, and I mentioned already Wolf Gruner. What I try to describe now is a kind of a resistance. I mean, coming to a funeral of an anti-Nazi activist and experience it as a political demonstration is a political resistance. It cannot threaten the stability of the Nazi regime, but I see it as a kind of a resistance, or at least defiance.
Yes, very good. Who else has some questions in the chat? We're ready to entertain all kinds of things. So Mark asks a question. You want to ask it yourself, Mark?
So I'm asking the question in the chat about, are you really talking about German Jewish habitus? That is from the sociological Bourdieu's concept of habitus.
Yeah, I mean, it's of course in my research, it's a central aspect. I mean, German Jews during the emancipation era were actually recreating the communal and family life in the path of the German bourgeois habitus. And during this, the time we're dealing now, they have to recreate and to adapt it. Sometimes they have to change it, sometimes they adapt it. I mean, let me give you another very interesting example. Part of the bourgeois habitus has to do with the domestic life. I mean, not only living in a private house, but also the way you shape the house, the division of parts in the house, a very clear division between different functions of the house, much more than today. And reading a diary of a Jewish woman, a widow who stayed in Germany after all his family immigrated. I think it's not a diary, it's a correspondence. She's writing to her children abroad about being forced to live in one room, but actually dividing this small room into a small living room, a small a bedroom, a small place of kitchen, which is a more symbolic thing, because it was a very small room altogether, but this was a way to continue to create the German habitus. And she writes, you might say it doesn't mean anything, because I will probably be expelled from here in a few weeks or months, but I want to make my life gemütlich. I want to make them comfortable. I want to make them to feel deeper. And I think this is part of fulfilling this habitus. And again, I see it as a part of another element of defiance. Another example, I have this picture. I didn't prepare it, but I could share it with you maybe later, of a Jewish woman, 80 years old, in a Judenhaus in Bamberg, 1941 or 42. I think it's in one of my articles, celebrating her own 80th birthday with a lot of flowers. And again, it's a way to express the bourgeois habitus, and also to say yes for life, even in these harsh circumstances.
Guy, can you define habitus, or how you understand it for our audience?
It's a kind, this is more a question in theory of sociology. It's a kind of behavioral values. I mean, the way you are dressing, the way you are shaping your home, the way the relationship between the genders are developing. So during the emancipation era, Jews adapted the bourgeois habitus, which means they have work and making money became very central in their life. A separation of the spheres between men and women became more central. Law and order is very, very central in the German habitus and the bourgeois habitus, following the lines of the law, a kind of hierarchies. Maybe these are only a few examples.
it looks like Allison has a follow-up question to her earlier one. I don't know if you have the chat up. It says, to clarify my question, is the pain of being forced out of one's home as a result of hatred different than it would be if it happened, for example, due to economic pressures like losing a
I
job?
think it's a very good question, and basically my answer will be yes and no. Because I mean, I was using some of the theoretical framework of social scientists dealing with the uprooting and gentrifications and how and basically, I mean, leaving your home and being forced to leave your home because of economic pressures, because of a relocation. It's really a feeling of deep grief, as a psychologist, Mark Griff, has written already in the 1960s. And I see basically some parallels. Of course, the element of hatred, which makes you lose not only your home, but also your homeland, makes it much deeper. I mean, and also it makes you feel that also in the new home, after being relocated, you might have to leave it again and again and again. But you can see the parallels. I mean, when I began my talk, I said that unlike what you mentioned before, Mark, any comparing of the American policy of vaccines to the Nazi policy is, of course, nonsense. But talking about the human individual experience, you can see some parallels, or at least partly parallels. And this is why we can use in a critical way, but we can definitely use and enrich Holocaust scholarship by using social sciences in different aspects. This is what I try to do in my research.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll pose a question if no one else is. I'm adding a little how in parentheses here. I'm assuming, so the question might be, did homes become more central as synagogues, as places of worship, or in what ways did they become more central? And did the
I mean, maybe the German term, I don't know how many of you, in addition to Mark, know German, the German term Geselligkeit, which is not Gemütlichkeit, has to be with, feeling at home in a more in an intimate way. Geselligkeit has to do with creating a social and cultural experience within the domestic sphere, and this becoming more and more popular. I didn't have sources about religious activities, but cultural activities, small concerts, small shows, weddings. You can see in one of my colleagues, by the way, Ofer Ashkenazi, is conducting a parallel research to what I'm doing using only pictures, family pictures, and he's got a fantastic consequences to his research. We have one joint article which I may share with Mark, and he can send it to all of you, about Jewish vacations in Nazi Germany. How Jews, under these circumstances, at least until the late 1930s, went to vacations. What does it mean to experience a Jewish vacation as a German Jew under the Nazi regime, under the terms of exclusion? And I was using diaries, and he was using pictures, and it's another example for this question of space or also time. But Ofer, in his work, he's got a huge amount of domestic pictures. You can see a variety of domestic activities during this period until the very end. I mean, I mentioned this birth date was in April 1942. You can see also how people like Victor Klemperer and many others were very frustrated in the beginning by being forced to live in other people in their own private space. It's really a challenge. I mean, we might love our colleagues, but we don't want to be forced to share our intimate space with them. But then they described how they become a community being forced to live together under the same roof. But this is part of it, and then conducting cultural activities together and so on is becoming more popular.
Guy, did you see evidence of religiosity blooming in homes and during these private gatherings? That is, do private homes become part of, sort of places of worship, maybe?
I didn't look for this. I didn't find. It doesn't mean there were none. I mean, this is not. I mean, I was looking for time and space. I didn't find. Maybe in the margins, but I didn't find it to be a central topic.
So most of your sources were from secular Jews, probably.
Not necessarily. I mean, Vilikon was very traditional, quite religious. I mean, but and he spoke about a lot about the synagogue, and of course he was praying during the high holidays at home when synagogues was banned. But home did not become, at least according to his diary, a holy place.
Mm.
Maybe the sources, which means, the diaries and the journals are more secular sources. Maybe German Jewry was more secular than Eastern European Jewry, for example. But the domestic experience, I didn't find it very deeply concerned with religious aspect, at least in my sources. I mean, you can always find other evidence.
So Misty asks, were there some Jews who opposed the use of the cemeteries as gathering places or playgrounds, or was it more a situation of everyone using whatever space they could to find?
I think that in the beginning, both using cemeteries and synagogues for secular purposes was there was objections to it. As I said before, when this community person came without covering his head, or the idea to have sport events in synagogues, it's insane. I mean, people, of course, were against it. And even Vilikon himself, who later on said, this is the only joy left for our children, was against it at the beginning. So you can see a process until people are understanding that the only way to survive this is to adapt.
So it looks like we've gotten to almost, we got time for one more question. One more just popped up. Let's see.
Lots of good questions. Go ahead, Mark. You want to read Michael's? That's the next one.
Yeah, let me get to it.
So Michael asks if you can comment based on your Yad Vashem encyclopedia of the ghettos during the Holocaust. While many are familiar with the ghettos in Warsaw, Łódź, Vilna, the dozens of others are less well known, along with the cultures of family, survival, worship, and resistance in them. Michael says, I can recall reading recently of the discovery of a Torah from one of the smaller ghettos.
Yeah, so, I mean, of course, it's a different question, a different project, but we had approximately 1,000 ghettos in this project. I mean, a major problem was to define what a ghetto means, and in our introduction, we discussed it a lot. And of course, in the smaller ghettos, you see very interesting and variety of phenomena. I will give you just one example, which is quite known. This is the ghetto of Tels. In many of the ghettos, the gender balance between men and women was very radically transformed, because in many places when men were deported and killed and women stayed for a longer time, and in Tels, they developed a full religious community and also a synagogue based on women, which for Eastern European Jews at the time was a real revolution under the very radical situation. Also, Judenrat was mostly women, which is really an exception and unique. This is only one example that we found in this project.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending this event. Thank you, Guy, for an interesting talk. We very much appreciate it. And I don't know about everybody else, but I learned a lot that I didn't know before. So I look forward to forthcoming research.
Thank you.
And great questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. Thank you, Dr. Meron.
Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day, and I really miss the opportunity to have face-to-face encounters, and I wish maybe in sometime in the near future we could meet in person. Thank you.
Professor Meron's first trip to the United States was to Cleveland.
Yeah.
How old were you?
I was 16 or 17. I was
so like 5 years ago then? Okay.
I was picked up to be a member of the Israeli youth delegation, and they spread out all over the United States, and they chose Cleveland for me. So I spent 2 weeks in Cleveland and 2 weeks in Cincinnati. So it was a very Ohio experience, and I didn't get back to Cleveland from then. It was 1983, so you can think about my age if you want. From then on, I didn't have the opportunity, and maybe sometime in the future.
Hopefully. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you.
Thank you. Bye.
Mark, I saved the chat, and I'll save the recording once we're finished here. And then we can figure out where do you want to put it.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Tim, for making this possible, and I hope I succeeded to deliver some of my ideas. But I can send Mark. I can send you some of the articles if you're interested.
Absolutely. When you have time, I'll have a look at them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I know it's getting late there, so thanks for staying up. And I'll be in touch in the next few days and make sure everything gets wired appropriately and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, no problem at all. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, we're good. I hope as soon as you hit the off button, the recording will render on my end and we'll figure out what to do with it.
Okay. Yeah, we'll figure out what to do with it. All right. I will, I don't think I have anything else. So see you later. One in the books, I guess.
All right. Congratulations. Went well.
See you.
Okay.